Hello, I'm Ramon Wrights, and it's a real pleasure to welcome you back to Cine Bijou for our second season. Over the coming months, we'll continue our exploration of independent film with thoughtful features and engaging interviews celebrating the diversity and innovation of the indie film world. Now, if you're new to Cine Bijou, first off, welcome, and I really hope you enjoy the show. You can also visit all our previous episodes on the following platforms: Spotify, Podbean, and YouTube. And should you wish to support our work, you can become a member on Patreon. Your contribution, however modest, helps us to spotlight voices and stories that might otherwise go unheard. So wherever you are, grab your popcorn and settle in as we present today's feature, a closer look at the filmmakers, narratives, and techniques shaping the future of storytelling. If you enjoyed the 6-hour-long deep dive that was In Search of Darkness 1990 to 1994, then trust me when I say you'll want to keep your eyes and ears glued to today's episode. Writer-director David Weiner of Creative VC is back, folks, and he's here to talk about the second part of his exploration of the lost decade of horror. In Search of Darkness 1995 to 1999 is now available on pre-sale, and details of how to get your order in quick before the deadline of 9th of June can be found in the show notes. Also in the show notes, especially for Podbean and Apple Podcast listeners, is the full trailer for In Search of Darkness 1995 to 1999. Spotify and YouTube listeners can have a tantalizing peek at the trailer now, but don't forget, to see the full trailer, head over to the show notes. In the run-up to the release of In Search of Darkness 1990 to 1994, 90s horror lost an icon, the late, great Tony Todd. And I just wanted to I wanted you to share some thoughts about Tony and his contributions to 90s horror, both through Tom Savini's take on Night of the Living Dead, originally by George Romero, and also the Candyman trilogy. I know some people only think of the first film as being the Candyman film, but the other two films obviously added more gravitas to the story, and he excelled in the role of the titular villain.
An absolute loss for the horror community. And I say horror community because Tony was very steeped in the horror community. He had absolute respect and appreciation for the fans and for the genre. That he was an actor with a capital A, and Tony Todd was in more than just horror, but he was known as a genre actor, if not a character actor. So it was very, very cool to see him just kill it. Like, you'd think with a remake of George Romero's Night of the Living Dead, it what's the point of remaking a classic? But he absolutely redefined that movie and that role and makes that a magnetic performance. That's where he first came on my personal radar. I'm like, who is this guy? He's great. And of course, Candyman, the first one out of the gate really established, all due to him and that incredible voice, this iconic character for the 90s and for the ages. He did two more. They're not as popular as the first one, but they're still good, and he still comes back and he still delivers, and he's relishing that role and not phoning it in. We lost Tony too soon. I wanted to have Tony in Search of Darkness 1994, and we were talking to him. Unfortunately, he was too sick. and we did not want to share that information, and he was very private about his cancer battle. But I'd like to think that In Search of Darkness 1994 is just a small tribute to his absolute talent and a bit of a time capsule of his 90s work. So much more Final Destination franchise. The current Final Destination is out now. I think it's been 25 years since the last one came out. I've yet to see it, and I can't wait to see it, but I believe he's in there as well. And we all miss Tony Todd, and absolute. It's really, it makes me happy that I can have him pretty much welcome us into the 90s with In Search of Darkness 1994. If you watch the intro, I'll spoil the fact that after a little intro about 90s, and then we get into it with the intro graphics, right before he does that, he says, "Be my victim.
Be my victim."
You know, it's wonderful. It's wonderful. So yeah, a tip of the hat to the late great Tony Todd.
So let's talk about the second film. We are now at the second half of the 90s. Last time we spoke, and obviously in the last film, we looked at the first half of the 90s and what it meant for horror, and it was a big change, as we've said before, from the big, loud, garish, anti-authoritarian sort of sensibilities of the 80s, because that's what they were. It was a reaction to the political climate at the time, to an era, to a decade that was a bit more reflective and somber and unsure of itself. Let's face it, horror in the 90s was going through an identity crisis.
It's very true.
Not helped by the fact that some people, as you pointed out in the film, were saying, yeah, that's not a horror film. Let's market that as a thriller. So films like Silence of the Lambs, which are horror films, Single White Female, Final Analysis, Hand that Rocks the Cradle, they're horror films, but they were rebranded as thrillers to make them more accessible.
Mm-hmm.
The result of that is that horror looked to itself for an identity. Where do we go from here? And it kind of dabbled with a few things, didn't it? Like continuing some of the franchises to a point and bringing about new ones, and also dabbling in a bit of gothic horror with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and also Bram Stoker's Dracula. But something happened in 1995, and you've delved into that. You've got the documentary. So what was the game changer from 95? What sort of turned horror around in that decade?
Yeah, absolutely. I do want to clarify that this is a documentary that's in production. So I can only spoil so much. It's coming out at the end of the year. That's the plan. So we're doing pre-orders right now. So if I seem a little cards close to the vest with some of my answers, it's only because, I don't want to reveal too much. But generally speaking, this whole second half of the decade, you're 100% correct. Horror really did have an identity crisis. It didn't quite know what it was. Studios were still looking at horror as the sort of redheaded stepchild and selling horror more as a thriller than as horror. There were plenty of horror movies that they said, yes, this is a horror movie, go see it, horror fans. But it's all, Hollywood is always about the almighty dollar. And if you could call something with a different label to get more people to show up, and then they're like, "Oh God, that was gross. That's like a horror movie." Ooh, too late. I've already paid my admission fee, and I'm in the theater. So there was also an identity crisis for the first half of the 90s in that there was a huge spillover from the 80s icons. You had Chucky, you had Pinhead, you had the Tall Man, you had Freddy. You had Jason. I mean, all these guys, Leatherface, all these guys were just like, oh, wait, the 80s party ended? Not for us. We're sticking around. We're the after party, and you got to join us. And so whether it was in theatrical releases or straight to video, there was a huge amount of the 80s party, after party that was still going on. But I would say in the second half of the 90s, collectively horror movies kind of found their footing and their confidence. And I think it's really all, if you want to boil it down, it's really all because of a little movie that called Scream. You know, Scream is not a little movie, but it wasn't expected to be a big movie. You know, Wes Craven combined with Kevin Williamson. Wes Craven at this point, especially after People Under the Stairs and New Nightmare and Vampire in Brooklyn, he's basically like, what can I do to turn this into something that's a little more meta, a little more self-reflexive? Because audiences were changing, their tastes were changing, their expectations were changing, and they were more sophisticated. And people like Wes Craven were, and even like Joe Dante with Gremlins 2, when meta filmmaking started becoming a thing, they were starting to cater to what the audience wanted and expected, and also playing with their expectations when it came to tropes and the structure of horror movies. They were just getting more sophisticated. And so Scream is sort of the inflection point where all of a sudden it just blew up, not only for horror fans, but for mainstream fans who wanted to see a thrill ride at the movies with Monica from Friends and all these folks that they recognize in terms of sort of box office familiarity. Started a whole teen-driven slasher cycle. Every movie was marketed, whether it was like that or not, like Disturbing Behavior is kind of the next Scream. Half of the cast of Dawson's Creek and Urban Legend. Of course, you have The Craft right before Scream, but it's the same year. All of a sudden, Hollywood was like, this is where we want to be. We want to be teen-driven, meta, self-reflexive movies. And so that wasn't everything, but it did dominate the second half of the 90s.
It certainly did. And we mentioned Scream. We've talked about Scream before, actually, in reference to the predecessor, the films that preceded it, which were popcorn. But more importantly, there's nothing, there's something out there, or there's nothing.
There's something out there. Yeah,
there's
you
something
wrote a
out
great,
there.
I'm totally interrupting you again. It's
That's
the caffeine. Fine. But you wrote a couple things about meta filmmaking in the 90s that I really enjoyed reading. Cine Bijou. Bijou. I think people should seek out the stuff that you wrote about meta filmmaking and the sort of lesser known meta films of the 90s that really kind of helped fuel the Scream post 95 to 99, Bride of Chucky. All these movies were super duper meta at that point, but they did have quote unquote or arguably humble beginnings in the days leading up to Scream.
So let's quickly talk about that, and I want to know how much of that, or how that's going to take shape in the finished film when you do finish In Search of Darkness 1995 to 99. When you tell a story, when you're doing a story that is very meta, that's very self-reflexive, self-critical, even, it can be a good thing, it can be celebratory, but it can be quite critical. There's a certain way you have to do it as a love letter, but also as an intelligent piece. And there's always when something becomes the zeitgeist, there's a real risk that it can just then become being meta for the sake of it. I don't know if there's a Latin term for it, like with MGM's logo, but like trying to be meta to be clever. And I think that's probably what's happening. When we saw the range of meta films that came out following Scream, I Know What You Did Last Summer, you mentioned Urban Legends, even The Faculty was like a homage to Robert Heinlein in its own way. Was there a real risk, do you think, that meta was just becoming too popular and people were latching onto a trend?
I think any popular mode of storytelling that is done ad nauseum always risks burnout, fatigue, self-parody, to the point where you got to the scary movie comedies, where there were many of those. I think that probably is sort of the definition of where these were ultimately heading, to the point where sure, it's clever, sure, it's snarky, but at a certain point, it's just satire and comedy, even if they're trying to tell a straightforward story. Yeah, of course there's a risk, but going back to Hollywood and the almighty dollar, it doesn't matter what the content is. If the content is something that's flypaper to audiences to pay for their popcorn and watch a movie on a Friday night, they'll keep on churning those out until they peter out. And to your point, the sort of the teen slasher, the teen driven meta films that dominated the second half of the 90s in the wake of Scream and The Craft and so on. That was pretty short lived. That was about 5 years, about 5 years or so. Now, it didn't disappear. I think movies to this day absolutely mine the success of those films. Of course, we have the Screams, sequels now that have done so well. They keep on making more. I Know What You Did Last Summer is coming back this summer or very soon. It's coming back. It's being remade. I heard someone's remaking Idle Hands. Um, Filmmakers today, whether it's a remake of a 90s film franchise or one-off, or if it's just mining the best stuff like Cabin in the Woods, making fun of tropes and playing with expectations. Fundamentally, it's a popular enough genre, a subgenre where people love it and people kind of expect it. Audiences are so sophisticated that when things sort of turn in on itself, or the snake eating its tail at that stage, it's not the time to stop, but sometimes it's the time to reconfigure. That's what Wes Craven was doing in the early 90s, where he's just like, everyone knows the structure of a horror movie. You can't do that anymore and expect people to be shocked and entertained unless you really are innovative in some way, shape, or form in terms of your storytelling. And that's sort of where meta really became something that he really doubled down on. But even he was sort of a little tired of that. By the time when Scream 2 came out, Scream 2 was a big joke, for lack of a better word, about Scream 1. You have the movie Stab, that an audience of ghost faces are watching Stab on the big screen, which is a movie about the movie that did really well.
Yeah.
It's meta, but it's meta exponentially personified. So where are we now with all this stuff? I think, what happened afterwards was, where do we go? The pendulum always swings to the extreme. And for entertaining and snarky and funny and knowing, we went really hard the opposite direction to torture porn, Hostel, films like the Saw franchise. Where, it's kind of like grunge in the early 90s. It's like going back to basics and turning the amp up to 11, and the fuzz is as loud as possible.
But so with the second part, then you're obviously going to explore the explosion of meta horror filmmaking into the mid and late 90s. What other things are, without giving too much away, because 90s horror, just looking at the list of some of the films and franchises that are available, like the witchcraft films, Troublesome, Children of the Corn, even Halloween, whilst kind of fitters out a little bit, then comes back with H20.
6 and then H2O, indeed, yeah.
Exactly.
It is H20, but it looks like H2O because that's what everyone called it.
Yeah.
I'm like, Halloween water? Sorry, please continue.
No, that's fine. H20, which I enjoyed, by the way. I thought that was really nice and refreshing. So there's an explosion of franchises. So there's so much to talk about, so many stories to tell. So what's going to be the focus of the second part of your exploration of 90s horror?
I've established at this point a nice balance that people really respond to. I kind of got there by the time I got to In Search of Darkness Part 3, the third visit to the 80s. I did this balance of studio films that had yet to be explored, lots of indie productions, lots of straight to video productions, and lots of shot on video. So you get the high and the low, but everything is on an even playing field. And because the response to that was incredibly strong, finally, it's, arguably it's the best one yet because of this balance. That's what I approached the In Search of Darkness 90s collectively as a decade. That's how I want to keep on doing it. So I did that for 90 to 94. where I really do have that massively different spectrum of films, studio to indie to eclectic. I will continue with that with part two, as well as I will still continue to include some select TV things as well. But it's one of those things where, because whether you have franchises, you've got one-offs, you've got big studio films, you have lots of great, really innovative, really fun, really goofy, and really way wacky, over the top, shot on video in your backyard kind of stuff. I think people love to be reminded about certain films and to discover certain films that they've never seen before and never heard of, because a lot of these movies, for the In Search of Darkness documentaries, a lot of people are looking for curation, and they're looking for something for their list.
Mm-hmm.
They're looking for something that they've never heard of before. And when we're 30 years hence from a decade, this is sort of a tool to be able to say, listen, well, you know about Scream, that stole the spotlight. You know about The Sixth Sense and From Dusk Till Dawn, but do you know about this, or do you know about that? Other than the franchises that also continued on.
And do you think 90s horror developed a bit more? I mean, don't get me wrong, there's a lot of film in the 80s that were darkly comical and very satirical, paradoxical. But do you think 90s, especially the latter half of the 90s, was a time when horror could just have a bit of a fun and laugh with films like From Dusk? You mentioned From Dusk Till Dawn. That's both terrifying and funny in equal measures. And there's so many other titles like that throughout the decade. Do you think that the latter half of the 90s allowed itself to have a bit more fun with the genre?
I think there was humor to be had if you were looking for it in the first half of the decade, but second half of the decade, I think it did get more fun, because when we were talking about this, this sort of identity crisis collectively of horror films, they were trying to find the right note with audiences, and they were trying to find the right note with the box office. But I think also thematically and creatively, filmmakers were really trying to figure out, how do we evolve this genre and subgenres that come with it to make it rewarding for the audience and rewarding financially to keep mining this territory. But by the time the 80s, by the time the second half of the 90s came along, I agree with you. I think they were having a little more fun with it, and they weren't taking this so seriously. I would argue also that the first half of the 90s, this sort of hangover from the greed is good 80s and Reaganomics and trickle down economics that were not trickling down, and the disparity between the haves and have-nots really was pretty vast. I kind of feel like, while there were certain films that were sort of trying to take this on in terms of their reflection of reality, I think a lot of people wanted more escapism. And I think that's why a lot of these sort of teen-driven horror movies did sort of reflect a couple things. One, a little bit of escapism versus, the harsh socioeconomic realities that people were experiencing. But I think also a lot of the people who make these movies are now in the power to get a little nostalgic for their own teen life. And if they were teens in the early 80s, when a lot of movies were about high schoolers getting picked off one by one, if you're 15 years later, or even 20 years later, my math is off now, but yeah, like within a 20-year span, you get to make the movies that you want to see. I think you're touching on a lot of the high school stuff that you wish you'd like to revisit and work out your own mishigash with.
Mm-hmm. So, as I mentioned before, the film's still in production, so you're close to completing, and then at some point, the film's going to be made available later in the year.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think I've asked you this before with the previous part, so I'm going to ask you again, in exploring now this half of the decade. What films have you enjoyed revisiting, and what fresh discoveries and perspectives have you as a fan and you as a filmmaker gained from working on the second part?
Well, it's I have the best homework in the world. I have to watch horror movies from a decade over and over and over and over and over again. And I have seen many, 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 many of them. Of course, there are ones that I love that are on repeat, but there are also ones that I have not revisited since I saw it the first time around in the 90s in the theater, or grabbing it off the shelf from the video store. And of course, uh, I am not a walking encyclopedia. There's plenty of titles that I never got around to, but now's my opportunity to really check them out. Um, for one example is End of Days, Arnold Schwarzenegger, End of Days, the Peter Hyams film. Gabriel Byrne it's basically Arnold versus the devil in the form of Gabriel Byrne. And I saw that in the theater in the late 90s. I think it was 99 that it came out. And I remember thinking to myself, what exactly is this? I love Peter Hyams. I love seeing a Schwarzenegger movie. I'm not sure if I'm completely gelling with this hybrid of Arnold style over the top action and essentially kind of like The Omen or The Exorcist kind of thing. But and I remember walking away from that saying, well, I think it tried to be that plus 7. I don't know if it knows what it wants to be. It's not very original. That's what I thought at the time. But I've always thought about it. And I finally got back semi recently to give it a rewatch. And I had a smile from ear to ear. I was highly, highly entertained to the point of laughing out loud, because so much stuff is way over the top, from explosions to shootouts to all the supernatural elements really like turned up to 11 a lot today,
Go for it.
But it's one of those things where I was like, I really, really, really enjoyed that revisit, because now I can look at it from a different lens of reflection, and I could see what they were trying to do. I could see where it wearing its influence on its sleeves, but I think it stands alone as kind of an interesting subgenre of actually action horror movies that were part of the second half of the 90s. You got The Mummy, Stephen Sommers movies like The Mummy or Deep Rising, or From Dusk Till Dawn. There's sort of an action hybrid going on here that I think people don't necessarily identify as much. Blade, Spawn, these sort of horror superheroes. It was a cool thing that was happening at the time that I think, again, didn't get the spotlight because Scream steals the spotlight. But another one that I really like to point out that I had never seen, it wasn't until it was years later after it came out, but it was something that I dodged at the video store every time I saw it, because here in the horror section was Rupert Everett standing in a cemetery with a spade, and it's a movie called Cemetery Man. And I just thought, boy, what a dud, what a dud of a title. Does not look interesting at all. I'll pass. I'll get whatever else is there. But it would always sort of be like, Cemetery Man, you're not going to get me this week. Cemetery Man, no, you're still sitting there looking at me, but not interested. Sorry. But then I had friends many years later who were like, oh, you got to see Della Morte, this Italian film. It's really, really great. I'm like, really? What's it about? It's Italian horror? Yeah, it's all practical effects. It's very colorful, incredibly imaginative, very gory, very sexy. It's so good. It's so good. I'm like, well, who's in it? Would I even know who's in it? Or should I just go see it? They're like, oh, it's with Rupert Everett. There's a guy in the cemetery. I'm like, wait, what? Is this the same movie? Turns out it's Cemetery Man, which was the American release title. And now it's one of my favorite movies.
Oh, wow. I'll definitely have to check that out. And of course, any talk of 90s horror, especially in this particular half, must include Japanese horror. So films like
yes.
The Ring, Ring 2, and The Grudge. So presumably you've got people lined up, fans, experts, the usual crowd, and some surprise guests to talk about the impact that Japanese horror has had, not just in terms of our tastes, the way that Dario Argento and the Italian horror meisters impacted the genre. They've come in now and stirred the pot a bit. So have you been enjoying revisiting that particular sort of?
Absolutely, absolutely. There's a Japanese movie. There's this Japanese movie that I had heard of, but I had never seen before. So I finally had an opportunity to watch Cure,
Mhm.
which is a really great film. It's kind of a slow burn. Um, Perhaps I should tell you what it's about, but I kind of think a lot of these Japanese movies, the less you know, the better. They have a different way about them. They're not action packed, they're slow burns, most of them, but they really deal with ghosts and the supernatural and the unexplained. That's a sort of a running theme with them. But not always supernatural. You've got Audition as well. These are films that, while again, Scream was hogging the spotlight, and we're talking about the pendulum swinging, ultimately to torture porn. There was a desire at that time for horror fans, especially, who were trying to seek out something different than what Hollywood was force feeding us at the box office. And so, with the help of the internet, a lot of people were, which was brand new at the time, and becoming more and more common in the way people were using it to sort of share files or talk to people around the globe much more easily than you could even in the early 90s, chat rooms and so and not whatnot. J horror was something that was when people were starting to say, gosh, you got to see this movie called The Ring. Gosh, you got to see this movie called Dark Water. There's a lot of stuff there. There's definitely a spillover into the early 2000s in terms of when all these things came out. And this was in no way the beginning of Japanese filmmakers doing horror, but this was starting to catch on and people were starting to seek it out. And video stores, not Blockbuster, but the mom and pops, were starting to curate this stuff and put it out there for people to watch, or people were passing around tapes with each other. You got to see this. You got to see this, sort of Blair Witch style. And so it was the J horror explosion, but the explosion really wouldn't come until the early 2000s, essentially. But this was the beginnings of it, an absolutely crucial element, as the kind of the antidote to the mainstream horror, where horror was finally getting its time in the sun as being welcomed by the mainstream. So J horror was absolutely spectacular, and it's worthy of discussion in Search of Darkness 95 to 99.
So I think in terms of this half of the decade, what would you say, apart from the meta explosion, the J horror, what else would you say is a defining trait that you've discovered through your research and your interviews that it is a defining trait of this second
I
half of the
would say
decade?
I would say that there were sort of two films that span the decade and define the decade in different ways. One is Seven. David Fincher's Seven was, if you think about it, it's like, oh, another serial killer movie. Like when it first came out, you're like, well, Silence of the Lambs has made way for all these movies about serial killers that Hollywood with amazing production values are going to tackle. But this one's got a hook, the Seven Deadly Sins. But the way it was done, the way it was performed, Kevin Spacey, Brad Pitt, Gwyneth Paltrow, Morgan Freeman, amazing cast. David Fincher caught lightning in a bottle in a way that other films had not up until that point, to the point where even the opening credits, everyone said, I want something like that. And its influence in terms of filmmakers wanting to ape that style, if not a similar storyline or gimmick or hook, that really was pervasive. So if you look at Guillermo del Toro's Mimic, Seven is a huge influence. End of Days, Seven is a huge influence on that. That's kind of a defining look and feel to the grittiness that was there, opposite the sort of the bubblegum pop of the Scream and teen films that were very meta and self-reflexive. But on the other end of the spectrum indie filmmakers were really getting a tremendous amount of respect in the wake of Tarantino doing Reservoir Dogs and doing, of course, Pulp Fiction in '94. All of a sudden, the indie filmmaker was the darling of the industry. And what they used to do with no budget, getting hopefully some shelf space at any video store, now all of a sudden they're being courted by everyone, and Miramax and Dimension Films at every Sundance, for the next big thing. So indie filmmakers really had their material viewed and desired by Hollywood, trying to get it out there and trying to find the next big thing. That's kind of where Robert Rodriguez comes in. His calling card was El Mariachi. He made for only a few $1,000s. His family did the work and the craft service on there, and he donated blood, to be able to finish the film and get the funds to do it. But that led to Desperado, and of course From Dusk Till Dawn, and of course, The Faculty and Spy Kids, which is a super duper fun movie. Very versatile, amazing indie filmmaker, teaming up, of course, with Quentin Tarantino. Super exciting. So what am I getting at? People are paying attention to indie horror and the next big thing. And you get to 1999 and this movie that is, again, huge, super low budget, discovered, put out there with the most clever marketing in the world, saying this is a found footage film, which is something we didn't commonly use at the time. We didn't say found footage at the time, but they found this footage of these 3 hikers who went into the woods. No one ever heard from them again, but we now have the footage of what happened, and these filmmakers put it together, and they called it the Blair Witch Project. You gotta check it out. And before this went theatrical, it was absolutely a buzz at the Sundance Film Festival. I saw it before it came out theatrically because someone said, I've got the tape of those 3 filmmakers who were lost. We got to watch this. And we all got in a room and watched it. Forgot to take our Dramamine. I wish I had done that had I known in advance. And it changed the game, not only for how much an indie filmmaker, 2 filmmakers could co-direct something and put something together with found footage and a video camera and some amazing innovative ideas. But all of a sudden Hollywood is like, wow, we need the next big thing. But they also learned how to use the internet to market their films more cryptically to the advantage of the film project. And this thing makes over $100 million at the box office. Who knew?
I know it's probably a bit premature to ask this because I don't know when I'll get another chance to ask you this, but how you're progressing with the second film, and this is going to be the final chapter in horror, 90s horror, presumably, unless there's another 90s year after 99.
Never say never, but this is the plan, to do a 2-part film that essentially is going to be, 11 or 12 hours long.
No, that's fair enough. So I know it's hard even in 2 6-hour documentaries spanning 12 hours, it's still hard to capture everything. But where you are now with the film and where you're headed, are you satisfied that you are capturing the essence of the decade, what it stood for, how it was a game changer, and what it's done for the genre generally in terms of how we appreciate it? Are you happy with the direction that this is all going?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I could say with confidence, if you enjoyed In Search of Darkness 90 to 94, and if you believe that it adequately captured basically the entirety of the first half of a decade in terms of why films were there, why films were made, why films were successful, what came out, how that whole jigsaw puzzle comes together in order to tell the story of a half of a decade. Part 2 is going to be continuing on with the same structure and format. I'm so pleased with the interviews we're getting. My biggest problem is I feel like there's so much that I get, but I can't ultimately fit in there. So the trick is to put it all together to, as you said, give a real good portrait of now I'm talking about a collective decade, because we're talking about what's leading to 95 to 99. So absolutely. I mean, I'm excited to put it together. Being the completist, I'm always going to be like, the tighter I close my fist, the more sand is going to come out. You can't get it all, and we're not going to be able to put every movie in here. And I already know that in each year, no matter how many films I put in, mathematically, I got to stop at about 5 to 6 hours. And there's always going to be more left on the table. So can't get them all. I will always get that one movie you're like, yes, he did it. And I will always not get that movie saying, why wouldn't you put that in? That's just the nature of the game with these documentaries. But as a person who wishes I could put it all in there, at the very least, if I can't do a segment on it, I like to at least have a reference to it in the larger context conversation. At the very least, have a poster where you could say, oh, it's there. So at least they know this movie exists. That's kind of the game that we all play when we watch In Search of Darkness, and 95 to 99 will be no different.
Well, that's it for this episode of Cine Bijou. Thanks for joining us as we pulled open the curtain once more, revealing the world of independent film and the creative mavericks who make it all happen. You can find this and every other episode on Spotify, Podbean, YouTube, and of course, Apple Podcasts. And if you enjoyed this episode, why not leave a star review or drop us a comment? It's a small gesture, sure, but it means the world to us, and it helps fellow film fans find their way to us too. Make sure you also follow us on all the usual social media haunts: Instagram, Facebook, Threads, and Blue Sky. And for reviews, features and more, why not pay us a visit at our website www.cine-bijou.co.uk. And if you are spreading the word, please don't forget to use the hashtag #SupportIndieFilm, because every share helps keep great stories in the spotlight. Until next time, keep listening, keep discovering, and as ever, let's keep that indie flame burning.